As I say, you've been sending in your questions all day about inflation, so let's get to them with our expert panel. Let me introduce them. Joining me are the personal finance expert, Gemma Godfrey, Chief Economic Advisor to the Centre for Economics and Business Research and a former head of the Government Economics Service, Vicky Price, and Professor Adrian Pabst, Deputy Director of the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. A very good evening to you all. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on Sky News tonight. And our first question is a very straightforward one, but of course some very complex answers perhaps required to it. It is from Mary, who simply asks, how does a rise in inflation affect my wages? I want to get all three of you on this from your different perspectives. And let's start with you, Gemma. I mean, it's going to be very, very rare for anybody's wages to keep up with inflation at these levels, isn't it?
That's the big challenge, is that inflation really eats into wages. So inflation means an increase in the cost of living. So for every £1 that was spent, it's expected that people are going to be spending £1.11, which means across food, housing, heating and transport, things are getting more expensive. This doesn't necessarily mean that wages are going up. It means that wages can't go as far. So the same wage won't be able to buy the same amount of groceries or fill up a car with the same amount of petrol. It'll only affect wages if it's actually used to negotiate a higher salary. But from what we've seen, increases in salary are rising by about half the level that we're seeing the costs exceeding it by.
And so, Vicky Price, that then means people are getting effective pay cuts.
But not in all sectors. I mean, the interesting thing is if you look at the private sector, they seem to be getting increases if you add bonuses as well, which more or less cover the rise in inflation that we're seeing right now. And if you look at some subsectors within the private sector, areas such as finance, for example, and business services are getting above inflation increases. So there is a gap that's developing right now. Particularly those who work for the public sector, are getting very small increases. If you look at the average figures that we have until the April month, so the last 3 months until April, those increases were only 1.5%, whereas in the private sector they were 8%, and in some areas, as I said, they could be as high as 11%.
So, I mean, it depends clearly what sectors you're in. But overall, Adrian, perhaps, I suppose we should throw in there in terms of the effect of 9.1% and perhaps going higher on wages. There's also quite a few tax rises around for a lot of people.
Absolutely. It's not just inflation going up, it's taxes going up, it's thresholds being frozen, so people are pulled into higher tax brackets than they would have been had those thresholds been changed. And it's also things like benefits not keeping pace with inflation either. So there is this huge hit to household incomes. We find that about 60% of households have disposable income that is lower than some of their bills, and therefore there going to have to be lots of changes. They'll have to dip into savings, go into arrears, or take out debt. And of course, as is always the case with such a big shock, the poorest households are being hit hardest, and that's where the policy mitigation has to happen.
Good you mentioned that, because that's what our next question leads us into, this whole idea, and you perhaps can explain more to us about it, about a wage price spiral. Greg asks, why has the government said it would be reckless to give everyone a pay rise in line with inflation? We heard that today, the reckless word from the Deputy Prime Minister. Staying with you, Adrian, perhaps your thoughts on that?
Well, look, you know, this is a complex matter, and I don't think we can just say a pay rise equals, a further increase in inflation. Inflation is a combination of expectations and base effects. And, there is a question of, how much of this is needed to starve off either poverty for those who are at the bottom end of the income distribution, but also, will people actually spend it just to keep, their heads over the waterline? And to be fair, it's not up to businesses to fight inflation. That is a job for the Bank of England. The Bank of England has various tools at its disposal to fight inflation. We can't be saying, we can't have any wage increases because inflation might go up. That's simply the wrong approach. Inflation is a monetary policy issue and it should be dealt with by the Bank of England.
Well, Vicky Price, I mean, would it be reckless the government says it would be to give everyone, I mean, everyone that it can give in the public sector, I suppose, a pay rise in line with inflation.
I don't think it's so much on the inflation front where we need to worry. It's more that the government is going to have to borrow rather a lot more than it's doing already to pay for this. Now, I mean, the question is, can they? And the likelihood is that they can. There is a serious question, nevertheless, in terms of what happens with that pay. If that pay goes to the lower end of the pay scale, which is really where quite a lot of the public sector right now is in terms of the increases they have had, which have been hardly in line with inflation. The lower you are on the pay scale, the more of the money that you've got is spent on things like food and energy. Now, both of those areas are global issues. They are things that, as a government here, we can't do an awful lot about unless we reduce VAT, for example, or find a way in which we can cut fuel duty even more, so you can do a certain amount. But overall, those are global prices that are affected right now by the war in Ukraine, particularly. They were already rising, of course. So there isn't a huge amount that extra spending on those two areas, if that's what people do, is necessarily going to lead to a general increase in inflation. So I think we're looking at it from the wrong end. So this worry that if you hand more money to people, of course, if you then accelerate perhaps the inflationary trend we've already got, in other words, that money is used to buy all sorts of other things, up to a point it will, and that then results in a lot more demand for those things and therefore higher prices still, and we have shortages up to a point in terms of labor and also supply constraints, supply chains don't work particularly well, then yes, of course, it will start pushing prices up to a certain extent.
Okay.
But the main problem we have is energy and food, and that needs to come down internationally for it to make an impact on inflation here.
I see. Okay, well, we've got a novel suggestion from Paul, our next question. Paul says wages are going up for large chunks of the workforce at well below inflation levels. We all know that, which means they'll spend far less and slow the economy further. Pretty simple and straightforward. But listen to this suggestion. Would it be better to increase pay to near inflation and increase interest rates to 5%? Your thoughts on that, Gemma, from the personal finance viewpoint?
I mean, I think it's a fantastic question, because I think we are going to have to think. I think the government should applaud any type of open thinking kind of creatively to try and work out how to tackle this situation. Unfortunately, the challenge of increasing wages aggressively is that it becomes unaffordable for businesses, and they then are forced to lay people off. So businesses are also facing higher costs because they're also facing higher energy bills, higher transport costs, and this could also push some, if you're adding wages onto that as well, this could push some businesses out of business. And on the other side of it, increasing interest rates makes debt more expensive. So people on a variable rate mortgage, first-time buyers, it becomes much harder for them. And again, it means that people might default on their mortgage. And again, from the business perspective, it might stop businesses from borrowing to invest. And the big risk here, just to summarize it, is the big risk here is something called stagflation, which is you have a high rate of inflation. So costs are rising and rising, but unemployment is actually high. I'm not saying it is now, it's at record lows, but if it does become high because of that policy, it means that the government... Too far,
yeah. Swings and roundabouts, isn't it? There's always winners and losers depending on the policy choice you make. But Adrian, perhaps just on that suggestion, from the economist's point of view, is it economically literate to increase pay to near inflation and at the same time, you've got an inflation then spiral worry, increase interest rates to 5% to bear down on inflation? Would that work?
I think it's too crass an instrument, though, as Gemma says, it's a really interesting thought experiment. It's too crass because inflationary pressures would continue to build for the reasons Gemma's already outlined. And a hike in interest rates would be such a shock that we could go into a much deeper recession than we probably will go into. And that doesn't really help because then wages will have to be cut in order to get us out of the recession. So I just don't think that sort of thing will work. But I think what's really interesting is to ask the question, who should get a higher pay rise than they're currently getting? And what can we do about inflation? I mean, Vicky's absolutely right. There are global factors at play here. The war in Ukraine, supply chain disruptions, various complications around Brexit. And I think really the question has to be, how do we tackle some of those global forces while making sure that those on really low pay who are struggling at the moment to make ends meet get more support. So I think it's a more differentiated approach that we need. Interest
Well,
rates are certainly going to have to rise, but not as dramatically as from the current level to 5%.
Okay, well, we'll be getting some suggestions about that, targeting some questions about it a little bit later on. But we're going to have a break in a moment or two, but I just want to get Nitine's question in, which follows on, Gemma, from what you said in your opening thoughts. You know, he says inflation is out of control, the cost of living is unbearable, and although CPI is 9%, some goods are up 26%. Are we being taxed through stealth? And this is the point, isn't it? 9% is an average figure. It depends where you live, what you buy, how you travel, what your personal rate of inflation is.
Yeah, absolutely. And it does affect different things in terms of not necessarily for the inflation rate. I mean, in general, the amount that it's going to affect you will depend on, you know, the level of income tax you're paying and whether you get a council tax rebate. You know, that again, there are certain things that certain people can get and others can't. But in terms of the CPI, the way that inflation is measured, it's actually tracking the price of a basket of about 650 items. So, of course, price of milk absolutely skyrocketing. But we're also saying actually some costs have had to fall because there's less demand. So anything to do with like recreation, some things like that, those costs have fallen. So it's meant that on average, the price has increased by 9%, as opposed to there are absolutely extreme outliers that are really affecting families.
Well, let's squeeze in one more question before the break. Vicky, help us with Isaac's question. We need prices of items to be affordable to every citizen. Does the government need to get creative and find other ways of getting tax instead of coming to the same citizen? We are tired.
It's a very good point, because, of course, what we haven't discussed is that taxes for individuals are going up anyway. So there has been a freezing of tax allowances, income tax allowances, which mean that by stealth, if you like, we are paying more tax. So the government is collecting a lot more from us than would otherwise be the case. And with inflation and with wages going up, it's collecting even more. So there's plenty of money that the government is able to redistribute. But of course, there are other more innovative ways, such as, which has been tried already, windfall taxes, for example, wealth taxes, that would be another way, or taxing other sectors of the economy which have done well. There have been suggestions about, you know, supermarkets had done reasonably well, although they hadn't done well in the first year of the COVID problems that we all had. Banks have done well, and you know there are sectors that can possibly afford to pay more. But we are increasing corporation tax next year, and the real concern now is that you know we may in fact not even get that increase because firms are suffering across the board. Some sectors doing very well, but loads of small and medium-sized enterprises suffering, and yet sort of taxes have gone up, national insurance has gone up for everybody. So we are in a very strange situation where we are in fact going to be collecting more from the economy in the next year or two, whereas, of course, we need to then redistribute, just as has been said earlier, to those who need it most. OK, we're going to take that break right now. Plenty more when we come back, because coming up next, we're going to be looking at, amongst others, pensioners. They'll benefit from an inflation-linked increase in their payments. So we'll be asking then, are younger generations bearing the brunt of this cost of living crisis? Stay with us.
Big stories don't always come from big cities. I'm Lisa Dowd and I'm Sky's Midlands correspondent, and this is where I grew up. We can reveal that the driver who hit Harry Dunn is 42-year-old Anne Sakoulas.
Just met the president and we never thought we'd get this far.
This is what they're up against. The wind is the really big problem. It is back-breaking work and the smoke is thick. It's been working well. Water levels are dropping, but no one knows what impact further rain will have. What would you do if this place wasn't open? We take you to the heart of the stories that shape our world.
It's really scary. We're terrified.
In this community, I'm told that everybody knows someone affected by COVID.
Hopefully this will be the last wave.
I never knew they would make it. It's amazing.
Change seems tantalisingly close in this corner of the UK. Wales was the first to introduce the plastic bag charge. This is my patch, my specialism. It's also my home.
The inspiration behind our product came from understanding how big of a problem livestock methane emissions were.
Welcome back. You're watching Sky News Tonight. Now, the rate of inflation, as we've been telling you, hit a 40-year high today. So what does this mean for you, for households? Our panel of experts have been answering your questions. If you've been with us since the top of the hour, they are personal finance expert Gemma Godfrey, Chief Economic Advisor to the Centre for Economics and Business Research, and a former head of the Government Economic Service, Vicky Price, and Professor Adrian Pabst, Deputy Director of the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, standing by for more of your questions, plenty of them, as I say. So let's crack on. And this one, Professor Pabst, let me put this to you from Lincoln, puts it this way: increases in interest rates will not slow down these issues, but they will penalise millions with mortgages. How does raising interest rates impact inflation? How's it meant to work?
Well, raising interest rates should mean some reduction in borrowing and therefore, some less money circulating, I suppose, and, generally reduces some of the economic activity that does contribute to inflation. Now, I think it's true to say that just raising interest rates alone won't solve this. As we mentioned earlier, there are global forces at work, pushing up energy and food prices in particular. There are supply chain problems that add to all of this, linked to COVID, linked to Brexit and trade wars that are ongoing. So it is a complex thing. Interest rates alone won't do it, but it's one way to, bring down some of the inflationary pressures and also signal that the Bank of England are very serious about fighting this. And inflation is also about expectation, what will happen and how people might behave. And raising interest rate is both a real measure and a signal that the Bank of England is committed to fighting this.
Do you think they've gone just on that? I mean, okay, they put it up again, but I mean, it's still, the interest rate, main rate of interest is still pretty low at 1.25. Doesn't it have to hit something like 4 or 5% to deal with this level of inflation?
Well, I think over time, it will have to go up a lot more than it has. And we and others have been arguing for some time that monetary policy was too loose. But monetary policy is not only about interest rates, it's also about things like quantitative easing or the asset purchases that the Bank of England has been engaged in since the financial crash some, 14 years ago. So there's a whole, hinterland to this above and beyond interest rates. Yes, interest rates will have to rise more, but you want to set out a gradual path and communicate your plan quite clearly to the public and to businesses so that they know what to expect. The Fed is expected to raise interest rates quite aggressively, as it's done in recent months. That is the Federal Reserve, the central bank of the US. And of course, some people say it might reach as high as 4% by the end of this year. I don't think that will be the case for the Bank of England, but the Bank of England may well follow suit. OK, well, we'll see how that goes. Let's get to the nub of the different groups that are being treated differently by the government. Alex asks this: the government has agreed to reintroduce the triple lock on pensions, meaning pensioners will benefit from an inflation-linked increase in their payments. Inflation could be 10% by the time that is set. Why are younger generations always bearing the brunt? Gemma.
And this is a critical question. And this is why it's so hard for the government to be able to put out a policy that really benefits the people that are struggling the most. Because obviously there is pressure to help people. Pensioners aren't able to go and earn more money. So I find that makes sense. But I mean, we saw this as well whenever they came out with the COVID loans, people fell through the cracks. And absolutely, what the people that are bearing the brunt of this are people that are hardworking, that again, it's that squeezed like lower middle, which is people that they don't qualify for any type of benefits. They're not getting any form of support, but really they're on the edge of trying to decide between whether they feed their families or they heat their homes and how to get to work. And I think that's a real issue that families are finding. They can't afford the petrol. How do they therefore go and earn the money they need? So, and people that just getting onto the career ladder as well, that aren't able to demand higher salary increases are really being penalised.
Yeah, Vicky Price, I mean, there does seem to be, and it was a feature of some aspects of the pandemic and the lockdowns, there does seem to be this growing gap between the generations economically.
That's absolutely true. But of course, the younger generation has been able to go back to work and at least earn some salary, and the starting salaries are about 20 to 25,000. Some people have been working part-time, some full-time, but what you've seen is that there has been quite an expansion in job opportunities again, and we have very low unemployment. Pensioners, some of them work, but many don't, and the average income, if you like, if you add everything that a pensioner gets, some from the state pension, but 67% of what comes into the household comes from private pensions, it seems, in the UK. The average income that they have is about £15,000. So it's not huge. And the worst thing you'd want is to have loads of poor pensioners. And there had been an attempt to ensure that that doesn't happen again because of this triple lock, which, of course, as we know, was abandoned last year. So coming back to this makes sense up to a point because of the situation which very many pensioners find themselves in, including, of course, very high energy bills.
OK, specific question then from one of the younger generation. Well, I'm guessing that Jadip is an international student, of course, may not necessarily be in that category, but asks this. International students are facing hard financial situations because of inflation, cost of living and very high rent. Gemma, you might know this, maybe not. Are they eligible for any supporting scheme from the government, international students?
I mean, I must admit, I did do a bit of research, in anticipation of anything to do with international students, because I know that there's a big need out there for people to get support when they're coming from another country. If you go onto the government's website, there is a list of different schemes they have available, a lot also for UK students to try and encourage them to go abroad. I mean, I think the one in particular that I spotted was something around a postgraduate scholarship for international students. Now, of course, that isn't going to help people that are on their first degree, but there are criteria involved in order to be able to qualify for it. But yeah, I mean, looking on the government website and trying to wade through the information there, that might help, hopefully provide some help. And it depends on the college or institution you may be studying at as well. Plenty of them have bursaries and things like that, don't they? Yeah, absolutely. And I think the main message here is to go and ask for help, because it's not in anybody's interest for people to struggle. And especially when students are coming here and we've got such a talent shortage and we really are crying out for certain skills, that again, especially when there are certain degrees that involve some apprenticeships as well, all of them actually, you could then go to the employer that's involved in that year, that sandwich year, and see if they can provide any support. And quite often they do. They have certain things that they can provide to support people to make sure that they're getting new talent into companies. My goodness me, we're really ranging over the territory. Stay with us. Thank you all very much indeed. Plenty more roaming to go, but we've got to take another break. Coming up next, we're going to be turning our attention to the government. What is it doing to help struggling workers, and are its policies simply not working?
Welcome back. Now, the government is saying it would be reckless to raise public sector pay in line with inflation after it hit a 40-year high today. And that record has been reached at the same time as the most disruptive railway strikes for 3 decades, partly due to a dispute about wages. And tonight, the RMT union has confirmed that tomorrow's strike will go ahead after accusing the Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, of wrecking today's negotiations. He's responded by saying that is a total lie, as our business correspondent Paul Kelso reports.
The trains were back, but not to normal. Around 60% of services resuming on a day sandwiched by strikes that have not yet brought the nation to a halt, but may soon be testing patience.
I understand why they're doing it, but I also understand, I understand both perspectives, to be honest, yeah. I'm completely for it. I think it's right to strike when you need to.
I think they should get a bit more.
Even though it's impacted you how it has, it's caused you a lot of hassle, you still got sympathy.
Yeah, they could do a good job, do you know what I mean? They're decent guys, they're polite, they're nice and kind, do you know what I mean? But I think they should be given a little bit more, yeah.
Hopes of a breakthrough were always slim, but disappeared altogether after less than 3 hours of talks. The RMT demanding what it says is a threat of compulsory redundancies be dropped.
We came back here today seeking for it to be removed so that we could negotiate a settlement to the dispute. But we have been told now by the highest people in Network Rail they don't have the authority to say they can withdraw that letter. And there's only one place that could say that, and that's in the Department for Transport. So it's pretty clear the government have scuppered these talks.
Transport Secretary Grant Shapps called that a total lie, and Network Rail's chief negotiator concurred.
I'm so frustrated because our aim this afternoon was to move that forward, to make to move to the next stage of that offer, and essentially, but I can't do that on my own. And I can't do that if the RMT are walking out the room, when at the same time they're also threatening me with a strike tomorrow. We have to work within the funding that we can make available. I haven't got enough money to be able to fund a 7% pay rise.
One train operator has settled a dispute. Merseyrail agreeing a 7% pay rise with staff from the TSSA union. But nationally, Network Rail says the industry faces a crisis. In 2019, before the pandemic, there were 1.7 billion passenger journeys, generating £11 billion of revenue. But in the last year, there were just 990 million journeys, almost halving income to £5.9 billion. Union members say they face their own income squeeze. One conductor told us the rising cost of living demanded action.
Things are getting worse as time goes on, as food prices increase and energy prices increase, and that's on my current salary. If anyone is making a move to potentially tinker with my terms and conditions, and it's already a struggle, that's just an inevitable situation that I'm going to have to fight to protect myself from.
This was always a complex dispute about more than money. It's about modernisation, about the future of the railway. But with relations between the two sides having soured and the government firmly blaming the unions, there seems little chance of substantial progress until after strikes on Thursday and again on Saturday have played out.
Until then, the talks, like many trains, will be going nowhere. Paul Kelso, Sky News in London.
Well, as we've been hearing, the rate of inflation has risen to a new 40-year high of 9.1%. How are people and households being affected? Our panel of experts are answering your questions right now, many of them flooding into us here at Sky News. Joining us for this are the personal finance expert, Gemma Godfrey, Chief Economic Advisor to the Centre for Economics and Business Research, Vicky Price, and Professor Adrian Pabst, Deputy Director of the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. So, more questions for you all, and thank you very much indeed for your efforts so far. This question coming from Neil, and Adrian, take this on board. Neil asks, what is the government doing to help people who are in work but struggling with rising inflation? Tell you what, I'll ask you the next one because it's a bigger question. Gemma, you know some of the specifics, please. What is the government doing? I mean, there are quite a few schemes and many billions of money being given out by the government.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the main ones to talk about are the £400 energy rebate, and they moved that. They doubled it. It used to be £200 and you'd have to repay it, and now it's £400. You don't have to pay it back, and it comes directly from the energy provider. And I think the other one is, £150 rebate on your council tax, but again, only for specific areas. I mean, those are the main ones. The other things that because again, the question specifically was what support is the government giving people that are working? Because a lot of the other support was for pensioners and was for people on universal credits. So I think the other thing I would point to is that there's a lot of pressure the energy regulator is putting on energy suppliers, and it's great wording on their website to try and make sure that they're providing people with affordable payment plans. So I think a lot of the shift is actually moving onto people to speak up and speak to their providers, whether it's their bank, their suppliers, or whatever it is. And if they're struggling, to try and discuss maybe moving, reducing their monthly payments, having a break, or making sure that things are affordable for them, but having that discussion directly.
OK, that's good. So that's, if you're in work, that's what you are entitled to. But you've got to do quite a lot of the legwork, or certainly the finger work yourself. So this one, Adrian, from Sam. If inflation is so high, does the government handing out more money add to the problem? Do they need to massively cut back their spending? Are we in for another period of retrenchment?
Well, we've had periods of retrenchment which did not help growth and did not help, real wage rises, and have in some sense landed us in the current situation that we're in. We've been arguing for some time that fiscal policy should be looser at a point where investment is needed, where productivity is low, growth are low, and therefore more money needs to be targeted, because otherwise we're going to have an even deeper recession that we might already have at the end of the year. And recessions tend to hit the poorest hardest. So there is no real argument economically or socially for retrenchment at this point. The question, of course, is what does government spend the money on? And there are better ways and worse ways. One way is to help the poorest, and we might come back to this a little later, with more targeted help than the government have put in place so far. And then the other question is, what can public investment do to help unlock private investment and to invest in the right areas, skills, infrastructure, transportation, housing, and so on, so that the economy grows at a much faster rate? That's the real problem. Low growth, low productivity, low wages. It's a vicious circle, and that's the problem. When we then also face with global shocks, as we are right now, then it becomes really critical, again, for the bottom half of the income distribution in particular.
Well, you've touched on the concerns of our next questioner. Honor asks, are government policies simply not working to improve the overall British economy? What more should they be doing? Vicky Price, and Adrian was touching on it there, wasn't it? Investment, productivity, innovation, so many other areas.
There's all that, but of course that takes time. And we've been talking about the same problems for a very long period of time. So for decades now, trying to improve the productivity of the economy. There is an attempt to look at the regions, and the Levelling Up white paper that the government put out is trying to at least sort of make sure that many regions which in the past did not receive very much of government support in terms of investment, or even business support in terms of private sector investment, get a fairer share. Infrastructure has been poor in loads of parts of the UK. And if you look at productivity, it's been mainly London and the Southeast, which have been above the average for the UK, whereas everyone else is below that. So there are some big gaps, some big regional issues that need to be sorted out. But we've also got a problem with smaller firms not being able to really get the finance to expand. Now, if we start getting into a position now where monetary policies tightened and credit becoming more expensive, and the availability of finance generally is not going to be as free-flowing as before, then we will suffer long-term in terms of productivity growth. And the truth is that if you look at the latest forecast from the Bank of England itself, it just assumes that over the next year, we will hardly see any growth at all. And as has been reported quite extensively, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the think tank for the richer nations, now thinks that the UK will grow at the slowest pace than any of the G20 countries, the biggest 20 countries in the world in terms of GDP, except for Russia.
What a fine
next year.
Yeah, what a fine line to tread. Who would be an economic policymaker? Fuel question. Yeah, we knew we were going to get one of those. Daisy, asks this, Gemma. Domestic fuel and vehicle fuel companies are claiming price hikes are necessary, yet seem to be making huge profits, while leaders not taking a stand against profiteering.
I mean, this is such a hard question because what we've seen is the government came forward and actually had that attitude and gave and charged a windfall tax for the energy providers for that exact reason. You know, they're making much more money on the price of energy, therefore they should be actually paying more tax. And then they came back and said, but if you invest in future growth, don't worry about it. You know, we'll discount it. And look, I can't speak for the government. I don't know why they haven't made a stand, but all I can say is that the problem with domestic fuel and vehicle companies is that, you know, they've tried to do this for the big oil and energy companies, but what they've also seen, an unintended consequence of the higher energy prices, is a lot of the smaller companies went bust. And because the smaller companies went bust, it meant that there's less competition in the market. So for us as consumers, going online to try and find a better package for our energy, that there just isn't enough competition that's out there. So, you know, potentially there might be a bit of caution there to try and target companies too much, because actually what we need to do is we need to have more choice out there to be able to get better pricing.
Another question on fuel. Gemma asks this, Adrian. Why is the government charging so much tax on fuel? It is true, even with that 5p cut in duty a few months back, isn't it, that we have some of the highest taxes on fuel in Europe?
That is right, and it's been a very welcome source of government revenue over, you know, years and decades. And yes, the 5p cut to fuel duty was no doubt welcome by many motorists. But again, the question is that really the right thing to do when it proportionally benefits those with big cars who drive a lot more and are probably earning more than those who need their car to commute? It just doesn't seem like the best way of helping people, especially those who need it most. And absolutely, we should look at fuel duty as a structure, but then, of course, other aspects of the tax system as well. We've already touched on it a bit. We're taxing labour a lot, so national insurance contributions went up in April. Are we taxing capital in the same way? And then there's questions over land tax and all sorts of other taxation, but also, for example, taxes on certain businesses that have done extremely well during the pandemic, like the tech platforms. And I think that needs to be something done in the round rather than going for one thing and thinking that somehow that's going to make the big difference. It very rarely does. The tax system needs profound reform. That needs to be thought through, but things can be done very differently than they have been done over the last few years or decades.
And of course, when it comes to fuel taxes, we mustn't forget the climate agenda. Listen, we're going to take another break now. Coming up next, we're going to be asking, will prices go down when, if inflation is under control? Stay with us.
What we are trying to do is create a community project where people that have been censored online, specifically by social media platforms, by algorithms and AI, can actually have their images seen. So the unseen becomes seen. And it's really to create a discussion. Most of the community, most of the participants actually love the platforms, but the platforms, unfortunately, have got no common sense in terms of what they're actually censoring. So although most of us agree with censorship, we don't agree with the censorship of these types of images. Some of the imagery that is censored by social media platforms should be censored. The thing about this type of imagery is it's a kind of one size fits all practice, which it's taking images that shouldn't be censored. And the one problem that we have with it, the main problem, in fact, is there's no recourse. There's nobody to speak to at the social media platforms. You can't connect with them. It's that even when you want to complain about your work being censored or even your platform being shut down, it's a letter. You get one letter. You have to complain multiple times, and you can never ever speak to somebody about it. If you go and see the show in real life, the imagery in there isn't anything that you would be worried about your children seeing. It's pretty, safe. In all honesty, it's pretty. A lot of it's to do with societal and cultural norms. Some of it's small businesses, some of it's disability, some of it's a bit political. And I think that the problem is that, you know, we keep coming up against this similar thing with all the platforms where it's a one-way street and there's no common sense used. It's like all of these participants in this show, they love the platforms. They really want their work to be seen. And if you imagine being a young photographer wanting your work to be seen, or a young creative, and it being shut down because of this, as I said, one-size-fits-all policy, it really is very frustrating. And I think when you understand that most of this work is actually the product that the social media platforms are selling advertising on top of, it would be nice if it was more of a two-way street.
Welcome back. As you know by now, our panel of experts are answering your questions after yet another increase in inflation today. So let's get into the last section of this hour on inflation and the cost of living. We've got a very direct question from Paul, but it is the question that everyone's asking, and I'd like all of you to answer it for me. Paul just simply asks, are we on course for a recession? So, well, let's start with the economist's definition of a recession. Vicky Price, I mean, it is quite a narrow definition, isn't it? It's 2 quarters of negative growth. So, I mean, it could be very small negative growth, so not much of a recession, but it then also could be a howling global slump, which really causes pain.
It could. We don't really know what's going to happen in Ukraine. I mean, the war may last for quite some time, so we may have high oil prices, high gas prices, real food shortages for quite some time. Now, the question, of course, is going to be, are those prices going to continue to increase, or are they just going to stay at high levels? If they just stay at high levels, what we might find is that inflation, in fact, slows down quite significantly, because you're comparing a year ago with where prices are now. That's the way in which you measure that inflation. And obviously, if wages up to a point catch up, then people might continue to spend. But for the moment, the real worry is that because of the squeeze in living standards, and if inflation and prices stay high, then consumers are just not going to spend. And we're beginning to see that happening already. And certainly in the UK, we had 2 months of negative growth, which was March and April. You do need, as you rightly say, 2 quarters of negative growth for this. But the real worry that everyone has is not just that you might have recession, even relatively mild recession, we might be able to recover from that. The real concern I have is that if the monetary policy reaction, because we had a question before about interest rates going up to 5%, if it is pretty tough, in order to bring inflation down domestically, you really need to slow the economy down very significantly. So the concern is that we might end up with a global depression, not just recession. And that's why I think central bankers have tended to be reasonably cautious before raising rates. I mean, remember, we have in Europe, the European Central Bank, which still has a negative rate there. We have a number of other countries, such as Switzerland, for example, which raised its rates by 50 basis points. Hooray! The Swiss franc went up. It went up quite significantly when they raised their interest rates from minus 0.75% to minus 0.25%.
Wow.
And in Japan, they're still negative.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. Adrian, perhaps address this question. I mean, Vicky Price was talking about that. The role of psychology, I suppose, in recessions, talking ourselves into a recession, thinking ourselves into a recession, consumer behaviour, I suppose, business investment behaviour. There's a danger that the talk of recession becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yes, absolutely. So much of the economy is about confidence, is about spending, is about investments. And if people are quite gloomy about the future, then of course they might simply defer their spending, defer their investment, hoping that things will look a bit rosier further down the line. So that is definitely a problem, which is why strong leadership is necessary by both the fiscal policymakers and the monetary policymakers to chart a course, even if there is this heightened uncertainty. But we've had uncertainty before with Brexit, with COVID. That's the job of policymakers, to reduce uncertainty wherever possible, show a path out of this, and make some of the tough decisions in order, for example, to bring forward some investment, not just through tax deduction, but also by unlocking investment. There is a lot of money around, but it doesn't get spent or invested. And the question is, how do we channel it into productive activities so that the economy can grow, especially in the areas that are lagging behind, where there is huge need, but also huge potential. And that is, of course, the levelling up challenge. Some short-term gain or short-term wins are possible. You can invest in skills now that will help you with the labour market in 6 to 12 months. And so there's all sorts of things that can be done to avert this.
Gemma, give me the consumer perspective. I mean, we are covering right here on Sky News on a daily basis just how badly some people are suffering. They're not making conscious choices to preserve their money. They just don't have enough cash.
Absolutely. I mean, this is one of the biggest dips in people's disposable income, and people didn't really have a buffer anyway to kind of fall into, and that is the big concern. You know, they're fighting on all fronts, as I said. You know, food, housing, heating, transport. There's kind of no respite. And what's interesting is that when we talk about interest rates, they're at the highest level in 30 years, and yes, they're still at historic lows. But these are unprecedented times for a lot of people. A lot of people have never experienced this before. They're used to low interest rates, low inflation. And it means that this is an entire way of managing your finances, trying to anticipate a continuing rise in cost of living, you know, on all your essential goods. And also what's interesting as well is that, you know, yes, high interest rates are penalising people that are borrowers, for example. So people have variable mortgages. But what's bigger concern is that it's not really being passed through to savers. And that would be the hope, is that people will then be able to save more and earn more. And it's not happening. So people are really, really struggling.
OK, our economists, quick thought, I'll roll two questions together. They're pretty similar. Ian and Jeff are all really asking this. You know, where's the inflation coming from? I'm going to paraphrase. We'll put up one of them on the screen, but I'm going to paraphrase. You know, is it homegrown or is it imported or is it a bit of both? Vicky Price.
It's mostly imported. It's energy and it's food. And those are global issues, and all countries that we know are suffering from the same problem. Even the ones I mentioned earlier, which have quite low inflation, are beginning to see a little bit more of that happening. And the war in Ukraine has been a major contributory factor.
OK, Adrian Pabst, that bit from Jeff's question, I wonder if we can put it up there. Is it beyond our control, really, a lot of this inflation then? Is there not much we can do about it?
The factors leading to the situation are, to a large extent, beyond our control, but there are things that can be done through monetary policy, whether interest rates or the rolling back of QE, of asset purchases by the Bank of England, setting a clear course, using fiscal policy more to help the poorest, but also target investment. So there are things that we can do, especially to get growth up. And so, yes, inflation for the moment is high, but we shouldn't be saying, well, this is all global and therefore nothing can be done and just sit back and wait. That would be a terrible course. Policy making needs to be more proactive. OK. And lastly, to round off this, I mean, illuminating session, if I don't get time to thank you at the end, I'll thank you all now. It's been so informative. Gemma, take this for us. Ken, you know, everyone's wondering, will prices go down when inflation is under control? Or I'm just thinking about that question, Ken, actually, will inflation be under control when prices have gone down?
And I think actually Vicky articulated this so clearly, which is it's really important to get our heads around, which is inflation doesn't mean high prices, it means rising prices. So what actually could happen is people, again, it could be all across the news, don't worry, inflation is under control, but prices could still be high. What it could mean is they've just stabilized. You know, the hope would be is if they stabilize, people get time to be able to, you know, readjust to it, you get more competition in the market, you know, then obviously the hope would be that things would be able to improve after that. But there are quite a few stages we have to go through. And keeping in mind, we're set to see another increase in the energy cap in October. So, and also when we talk about interest rates, they weren't raised as much as people expected. So we're more likely to see maybe more aggressive rate rises further down the line. So there's still quite a lot of pressure coming before we're in that scenario.
Oh, yeah, more pain to come. Listen, thank you all so much. You've been absolutely brilliant. Gemma Godfrey, Vicky Price, Professor Adrian Pabst, thank you very much indeed. I'm sure we'll all meet again. This is clearly a subject that requires an awful lot of examination. Thank you.